before telescopes, before science, before space travel, the stars were not cold, lifeless rocks. They were alive. They were messengers. They were gods, and sometimes they were watching. In an age ruled by the church and shaped by fear, what did people truly believe about the night sky? Were they alone, or did something or someone live beyond the stars? For a medieval person standing under a moonless sky, the heavens were not empty. They were full, layered, ordered, alive. The stars were fixed to crystal spheres, embedded like lanterns in a vast turning mechanism. And at the heart of it, all was earth, still, unmoving, chosen. That belief wasn't fringe or primitive. It was the consensus. From peasant to pope, the cosmos had meaning. It had structure. It had God. This wasn't a universe known through observation. It was a universe accepted through authority. The framework came from a fusion of Christian theology and ancient Greek philosophy. Aristotle provided the mechanics, concentric spheres, each nested within another, pushing the stars and planets in perfect circular motion. Ptolemy's Almagest refined the mathematics, but it was the church that placed this architecture under divine ownership. Beyond the outermost sphere was the Empyrean, the dwelling of God and the angels. Heaven, quite literally, was up. Most people in medieval Europe had no tools to study the sky. Telescopes wouldn't exist for centuries. Naked eyes were the only instruments. But what they saw, brilliant stars, wandering planets, the band of the Milky Way, had deep symbolic weight. The night sky wasn't empty space. It was a divine canvas. Its patterns were messages. Its movements were consequences. Comets sparked panic. Eclipses sent people to prayer. These weren't astronomical events. They were signs. A comet before a king's death. A red moon before war. The link between the heavens and human fate was assumed, not questioned. Astrology, though controversial in some church circles, was practiced at royal courts and taught in universities. It offered the illusion that the stars weren't just watchers, they were guides. Yet, what lay beyond those stars remained out of reach. The medieval mind had no framework for space as we know it. There were no galaxies, no concept of a vacuum, no distant solar systems. The cosmos ended where God began. Anything else, other worlds, other beings, fell into the realm of heresy or fantasy. Curiosity existed, but it was bounded by doctrine. This worldview shaped every discipline: medicine, weather, warfare, even morality. Everything was connected through the celestial order. A sickness might be blamed on a planetary alignment, a failed harvest on a curse from above, and through it all, the sky remained constant, moving with eerie precision, yet locked in mystery. To look up was not an act of science, it was an act of faith. The stars were not dead matter. They were part of a living order, purposeful, eternal, and always watching. In medieval Christendom, understanding the heavens wasn't an academic exercise. It was a matter of doctrine. The stars, the planets, and the celestial spheres were not inert objects governed by impersonal laws. They were manifestations of divine order. According to the dominant worldview, Earth was the unmoving center of creation. Everything else, the moon, the sun, the wandering planets, and the fixed stars, revolved around it in perfect circles, encased within crystalline spheres. The farther from Earth, the holier the domain. This framework was not constructed by the Church from scratch. It was inherited from the Greeks, primarily Aristotle and Ptolemy, but the Church baptized it, gave it spiritual authority, and embedded it into theology. Aristotle had taught that the heavens were made of a fifth element, the ether, unchanging, perfect, and incorruptible. Ptolemy's Almagest supplied the mathematics to support this model, but it was Christian thinkers who interpreted this cosmos as the blueprint of divine intent. Saint Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 5th century, set the tone for centuries. He warned that Christians should not speculate on the structure of the cosmos beyond what Scripture affirmed. To Augustine, the stars might serve for marking time or illustrating divine power, but they were not to be treated as physical things to be analyzed, let alone questioned. He called such pursuits distractions and potential gateways to pagan error. Later, in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas merged Aristotelian cosmology with Catholic theology. Aquinas believed that each celestial sphere was moved by a spiritual force and intelligence, which he identified with angels. This meant that the stars themselves weren't lifeless objects. They were part of a cosmic system animated by spiritual entities, operating in absolute harmony with God's will. Astrology, while viewed skeptically by many theologians, was widely practiced. Monarchs employed astrologers. Universities taught astrology as part of the quadrivium. But there was a boundary. The stars could influence the body and natural world, not the soul or moral decisions. Suggesting otherwise challenged the doctrine of free will, a dangerous misstep in church logic. By the 1200s, the church began formalizing limits on what could be questioned. In 1277, Bishop Etienne Tempier of Paris condemned over 200 philosophical propositions taught at the University of Paris. One of them, the claim that God could not create many worlds. Ironically, the Church condemned this, not because it supported the idea of multiple worlds, but because it placed a limit on God's power. Still, the result was chilling. The mere discussion of other possible worlds was now under scrutiny. The idea that other beings could exist beyond the stars posed a theological dilemma. If intelligent life existed elsewhere, did they sin? Were they part of the fall? Would they require salvation through Christ? If so, would Christ have to incarnate more than once? Such questions struck at the heart of Christian soteriology. The safer option was silence. Cosmological inquiry had consequences. In the early 14th century, philosopher William of Ockham walked a thin line by suggesting God's omnipotence could allow for other worlds, but he wrapped it in heavy theological caution. Even Nicholas of Cusa, a 15th century cardinal who speculated about life beyond Earth, did so ambiguously, cloaked in metaphysical language rather than direct assertion. The heavens, to the Church, were sacred, not to be dissected, questioned, or imagined beyond the boundaries of divine order. To suggest otherwise was to risk not only intellectual condemnation, but spiritual rebellion. In this world, curiosity was not a virtue. It was a potential heresy. The medieval mind was not shaped in isolation. It inherited a framework from the classical world, ideas developed centuries earlier in the schools of Athens and Alexandria. When monks copied manuscripts and theologians debated cosmology, they were often speaking the language of ancient Greece, filtered through a Christian lens. Aristotle's vision of the cosmos became the foundation. Writing in the 4th century BCE, he described a universe built on concentric spheres, with Earth at the center. Each sphere carried a planet, the sun, or the stars, rotating in perfect circles. Beyond the final sphere was the prime mover, a non-physical force that set the whole system in motion. This model explained celestial movement without needing divine intervention at every step, but it wasn't atheistic. It was ordered, purposeful, by the 2nd century CE. Claudius Ptolemy expanded on this system in his Almagest, refining the mathematics that could predict planetary paths. Though complex and sometimes inaccurate, his geocentric model became standard for over 1,000 years. Ptolemy's calculations, combined with Aristotle's metaphysics, formed the backbone of medieval astronomy. But it was Plato who gave the heavens their soul. In his dialogue, Timaeus, written around 360 BCE, Plato imagined the cosmos as a living creature, endowed with reason, created by a divine craftsman. The stars were not just points of light, they were beings, moving in harmony, part of a greater rational design. His student Aristotle would later strip this vision of its mythic tone. But the philosophical foundation remained. The universe had structure. The stars had purpose. This led to the idea of the music of the spheres. Though no literal music played in the sky, it was believed that the motion of the celestial spheres produced a kind of divine harmony inaudible to human ears, but real nonetheless. Medieval thinkers such as Boethius in the 6th century revived this concept, linking cosmic order with musical and moral order. To live virtuously was to be in tune with the universe. These layers of thought culminated in the great chain of being, a hierarchy that placed everything in creation in a fixed order. God reigned at the top. Below were angels, then humans, then animals, plants, and minerals. Each level reflected increasing distance from divine perfection. Humans occupied a unique position, rational but mortal, capable of ascending toward angelic understanding or descending into animalistic behavior. The stars, existing in the celestial realm, were above humans, closer to the divine. This framework shaped not only medieval cosmology, but medieval psychology, politics, and theology. It justified monarchy as natural hierarchy, framed human suffering as part of divine order, and made the stars part of a living, purposeful system. The idea that humanity might be alone, that the stars were dead, silent, or irrelevant, simply didn't fit. Ancient voices still echoed in cathedral schools and monastic libraries. Their ideas, adopted and adapted by the Church, created a cosmos that was ordered, moral, and inhabited, not necessarily by aliens, but by intelligences, patterns, and divine presence. To medieval thinkers, the stars weren't empty. They were full of meaning, of motion, and of memory. Across medieval Europe, unexplained events in the sky were rarely seen as natural. A sudden flash of light, an unusual star, a glowing shape at night, these weren't dismissed or studied. They were interpreted. Often they were feared. In an age without telescopes or modern science, the sky was a spiritual realm. What appeared above wasn't just distant, it was significant. Celestial phenomena, especially those that broke the expected order, were read as messages. Comets in particular carried heavy meaning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded a blazing star in 1066, shortly before the Norman invasion. To those chronicling the event, the comet wasn't a coincidence, it was a sign. The appearance of Halley's Comet was widely believed to foreshadow political upheaval, war, or death. These beliefs were not isolated to England. In France, Germany, and Italy, similar reactions were recorded. The heavens, it was believed, did not behave strangely without reason. Beyond comets, the concept of moving stars or unfamiliar lights took on a more spiritual or even supernatural tone. Medieval theology placed angels within the celestial hierarchy. According to Dionysius, the Areopagite celestial hierarchy, which heavily influenced Christian thought from the 6th century onward, angels occupied specific roles across different levels of the heavens. Some were messengers, others were guardians of cosmic order. A sudden light, then, might be interpreted as an angelic presence, especially if it coincided with a major event. But not all lights in the sky were welcomed. Demonic forces, too, were believed to inhabit the spiritual layers above Earth. Medieval demonology, drawn from both scripture and local folklore, suggested that devils could manipulate the air and fire, the classical elements closest to the celestial domain. A strange or flickering light at night might just as easily be seen as a demonic deception. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX formally established the Papal Inquisition. Around this time, reports of flying demons, witches in the sky, and infernal visions became more common in ecclesiastical records. Monastic scribes were often the first to document such events. A 12th century chronicle from Peterborough Abbey described shields of fire moving through the sky. In 1254, monks at St. Albans reported seeing a large, round object glowing in the night above their priory. These descriptions did not match comets or eclipses. They were interpreted through a theological lens, angelic, demonic, or divine. Cosmic events were rarely viewed as random. An eclipse might symbolize God's displeasure. A meteor shower could be read as a warning. The death of a king, a major battle, or a heretical uprising often followed, or was thought to follow, some unusual sign in the heavens. These connections were drawn not through evidence, but belief. The sky wasn't distant. It was responsive. Occasionally, more bizarre interpretations appeared. In 9th century France, Bishop Agobard of Lyon wrote a treatise denying the belief that people from a mythical region called Magonia traveled in ships through the air to steal crops during storms. Yet, the fact he felt compelled to refute it shows how seriously such skybound myths were taken. In the medieval view, the heavens were layered with purpose. Angels patrolled the upper spheres. Demons lurked in the shadows between worlds. Lights and movements in the sky weren't anomalies. They were messages, actors, or omens. The line between religious vision and cosmic encounter was thin. The medieval world saw no contradiction in interpreting celestial events as both spiritual and real. They weren't imagining beings from beyond. They were responding to a universe they believed was already watching in the heart of the Islamic world. While Europe filtered the heavens through scripture and doctrine, a different approach was unfolding, one grounded in observation, mathematics, and inherited knowledge from antiquity. Between the 8th and 14th centuries, Islamic scholars in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba developed astronomy into a refined science, centuries ahead of anything seen in Christian Europe. This wasn't mere stargazing. It was driven by necessity and theology. Islamic law required accurate timing for prayers, fasting, and direction of worship toward Mecca. These practical needs led to investments in instruments, observatories, and translations. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, established the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, where Greek texts were translated into Arabic, including the works of Ptolemy, Aristotle, and Hipparchus. But these texts weren't just preserved. They were corrected, expanded, and challenged by the 10th century. Scholars like al-Battani had refined Ptolemy's astronomical tables. Ibn al-Haytham applied experimental methods to optics, And in the 11th century, Al-Zarqali in Toledo constructed precise astrolabes and developed the Taladan tables used across Europe for centuries. Observatories in Moraga and later in Samarkand employed full-time astronomers who systematically recorded the heavens, recalculated planetary orbits, and questioned inherited cosmologies. Some thinkers went further. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, a 12th century Persian theologian and philosopher, openly speculated about the existence of multiple worlds. In his commentary on the Quran, he wrote that God's power was not limited to creating one world, and that there could be many others beyond human understanding. This did not challenge divine authority, but it raised questions about humanity's uniqueness, questions that medieval Christian Europe avoided or suppressed. These ideas and discoveries slowly entered Europe through translation hubs in Muslim Spain and Sicily. Beginning in the 12th century, scholars like Gerard of Cremona translated dozens of Arabic texts into Latin. The works of Al-Ghani, Avros, and Al-Hazen became known to European thinkers, reshaping astronomy, optics, and cosmology. The influence was not loud or acknowledged publicly. The Church remained cautious, but by the late Middle Ages, Latin scholars were working with Islamic astronomical tools, models, and methods. The Alphonsine tables, commissioned in Castile, were built directly on Islamic precedents. Nicolaus Copernicus himself cited Arabic astronomers in his early manuscripts. Islamic astronomy didn't just offer more precise data, it introduced a worldview where the heavens could be studied without fear of heresy. It allowed space for questioning, calculating, and even imagining. And in doing so, it quietly expanded the boundaries of what was thinkable in Europe. In the early 9th century, long before the concept of extraterrestrials entered the scientific imagination, a strange belief circulated among the people of the Carolingian Empire. In the region of Lyon, whispers grew into claims that ships had been seen in the sky. Not celestial visions or divine signs, but actual vessels sailing through the clouds, and with them figures not of this world. Some said they came from a land called Magonia, and that their purpose was theft, stealing crops by manipulating the weather. Bishop Agobard of Lyon, a prominent figure in the Frankish Church and an ally of Emperor Louis the Pious, decided to confront these rumors. Directly, around 815 CE, he wrote a letter titled De Grandin et Tonatruis, on hail and thunder. In it, Agobard dismissed the idea of Magonian skyships as superstition and heresy. He was not addressing isolated fantasy. He was reacting to a belief that had grown popular enough to lead to violence. According to Agobard, a group of peasants had captured 4 individuals accused of descending from these skyships to sabotage crops. The crowd intended to kill them. Agobard intervened and denounced the entire story as false, a product of ignorance and fear. He used the event to criticize the widespread reliance on magicians, whether wizards, and what he saw as pagan thinking. Embedded in rural Christian communities, the tale reveals several things. First, that belief in otherworldly visitors, not angelic or demonic, but physical, existed well before the modern age. Second, that the boundary between spiritual and natural phenomena was not clearly defined in the medieval mind. Weather, disease, crop, failure, all were open to supernatural interpretation. If people could believe storms were conjured by sorcerers, it wasn't a large leap to believe ships could ride those storms. The term Magonia has no clear origin. it appears only in this context. Some scholars have suggested it derives from Latin or regional dialects referring to clouds or magic. But what's notable is how the story spread, despite, or perhaps because, of Agabard's efforts to suppress it. His letter survives not as a successful refutation, but as a record of how far the story had traveled. Agabard's rejection of the tale was theological. For him, it undermined the order of the world as established by God. Nature was under divine control, not the manipulation of imagined sky. But the people of Lion, facing real hardship from weather and war, looked elsewhere for explanations. And in that gap between lived suffering and theological rigidity, stories like Magonia took root. This was not science fiction in the modern sense, no advanced technology, no distant planets, but it was something close, an early attempt to place the inexplicable into a framework of meaning. Whether as scapegoats, legends, or proto-aliens, the sky people of Magonia reflected the limits of official doctrine and the persistence of popular belief. By writing against it, Agabard preserved the story he wanted to erase. And in doing so, he gave us one of the strangest and most revealing documents of early medieval cosmology. Medieval Europe recorded more than just battles and saints. Scattered across chronicles, sermons, and religious visions are strange accounts, stories of lights that moved against the stars, wheels of fire descending from the clouds, and figures described not as angels or demons, but something in between. To a modern reader, some of these accounts raise a question the writers themselves may never have intended to ask. Were they describing something real, something beyond Earth? In the year 776, monks at the Abbey of Fulda, in present-day Germany, recorded a curious event. During a siege on the monastery at Sigeberg by Saxon forces, flaming shields were seen in the sky, hovering over the church. The Saxons, fearing divine wrath, fled the battlefield. The event was interpreted as a sign from God, an angelic intervention. But the description, fiery, disc-shaped objects, silently moving above a military encounter, has led some modern readers to draw comparisons to contemporary reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. Similar images appear elsewhere. In the Annales Loricenses, another 8th century Frankish chronicle, there is a record of 2 shields, red with flame, appearing in the sky, again during battle. The pattern is notable. The sky intervenes in moments of crisis. The form is consistent, circular, bright, fiery, unnatural. The interpretation, however, always returns to the spiritual. The Bible itself contains imagery that has fueled centuries of speculation. The Book of Ezekiel, likely composed in the 6th century BCE, but read and interpreted throughout the medieval period, contains one of the most discussed visions in history. Ezekiel describes a wheel within a wheel, full of eyes, accompanied by beings with multiple faces and wings. Medieval theologians took this as a symbolic vision of divine glory. Later interpreters, outside the bounds of religious orthodoxy, saw in it a potential description of something mechanical, something advanced. In 13th century England, the chronicler Gervas of Tilbury recorded tales of men descending from the sky, including one story of a man captured by locals who claimed to have fallen from the cloud ships above. Much like the Magonia tale reported by Bishop Agabard, this was framed as folklore, strange, but not impossible to believe for communities that viewed the sky as inhabited and responsive. So what were these accounts? Meteor showers misinterpreted through the lens of faith. Atmospheric events like ball lightning, Or were they sincere records of something anomalous, described in the only vocabulary available, the language of religion? To the medieval mind, there was no framework for extraterrestrial life as understood today. There was no universe as a vast expanse of stars and planets. There was only Earth, the heavens, and the spiritual hierarchy that ruled them. Any visitor from the sky had to fit into that system, as angel, demon, or divine sign. But there, descriptions leave space for ambiguity. Bright objects, unfamiliar shapes, beings neither fully human nor entirely divine. Whether these were allegories, misunderstandings, or something unexplained, the records exist. They weren't written by science fiction writers. They were recorded by scribes, monks, and witnesses, people who believed in what they saw, even if they didn't understand it. In the medieval world, astrology wasn't a curiosity, it was a system of knowledge woven into medicine, politics, and religion. It operated on the belief that celestial bodies didn't just move, they influenced. The stars and planets were thought to exert real effects on human affairs, shaping personality, fate, and the outcomes of battles, births, and dynasties. Astrology was taught in universities as part of the quadrivium, alongside arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. It wasn't hidden or condemned, it was mainstream. Astrologers held positions of power at court. Their charts influenced royal marriages, military campaigns, and the timing of coronations. In 1226, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire employed astrologers to determine the most favorable moment to set out on crusade. In England, King Edward II consulted astrologers before battles. Even the Avignon popes had personal star readers. The boundary between faith and fate was porous. This belief rested on a cosmological assumption that the universe was a unified whole. Everything was connected through a series of correspondences. Stars to metals, planets to humors, constellations to organs. A child born under Saturn might be slow and melancholic. A ruler born under Mars might be violent and ambitious. These were not metaphorical traits. They were seen as literal outcomes of celestial configuration. The Church, while cautious, did not outright reject astrology. Its concern was not with the concept, but with its implications. If the stars determined human behavior absolutely, then what happened to free will, to sin, to salvation? The solution was compromise. Astrology could reveal tendencies, inclinations, not certainties. It could be used to understand the natural world, but not to predict or justify moral choices. That distinction allowed astrology to thrive without crossing into open heresy. Medical astrology became its own discipline. Physicians used star charts to determine when to perform surgeries, prescribe treatments, or diagnose illness. The timing of bloodletting, a common practice, often depended on lunar phases. In 14th century Paris, hospital records show astrological consultations were routine. Illness was not seen as purely biological. It was cosmological, but the larger question remained unspoken. If the stars had influence, did they also have awareness? Did their regularity and effect imply intelligence? Some medieval philosophers speculated that celestial bodies might be moved by spiritual intelligences, a belief inherited from Aristotle and Christianized by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. Others stopped short, content to treat the stars as instruments of divine will. The belief in stellar influence added weight to the sky. It wasn't just decoration, it was active. It shaped life, guided fate, and hinted at forces far beyond human control. For the people who lived under it, the sky was more than a mystery. It was a presence, one that watched, and sometimes decided. In the early 14th century, Dante Alighieri gave Western Europe one of its most enduring visions of the cosmos, a structured, layered universe in which theology, astronomy, and poetic imagination converged. The Divine Comedy, completed just before Dante's death in 1321, was more than a literary work. It was a roadmap of the medieval universe, as understood by both science and faith. The Paradiso, the final section of the comedy, describes a celestial ascent. Dante, guided by Beatrice, moves upward through 9 concentric heavens. Each one corresponds to a known celestial body: the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars, and the primum mobile. These were not abstract ideas. They reflected the actual astronomical model accepted in Dante's day, rooted in Ptolemaic geocentrism and Aristotelian metaphysics, integrated with Christian doctrine. In Dante's model, each planetary sphere is associated with a specific virtue and inhabited by souls who exemplify it. On the moon, he encounters souls who broke vows. On Mercury, those who pursued fame. On Venus, souls driven by love. The higher he ascends, the more refined the souls become, until he reaches the realm of the angels and beyond that, the Empyrean, where God resides. But Dante wasn't writing a scientific treatise. He was constructing a theological and moral architecture. The heavens were not physical destinations. They were reflections of inner states, levels of spiritual attainment. Still, his attention to astronomical detail was exact. He references equinoxes, planetary retrograde, and the precession of the equinoxes. His cosmos was spiritually charged but mathematically precise. What stands out is how seriously Dante took the stars. They were not distant, cold objects. They were domains of meaning, realms where the human soul, after death, might dwell. His universe wasn't just symbolic, it was inhabited, not by aliens, but by the redeemed. The stars had depth. They were not backdrops, but territories. In one of the final cantos, Dante turns and sees Earth as a small point beneath him, suspended in the vast, spinning order of heaven. It's a moment that reflects a shift in perspective, not scientific, but spiritual. Yet it anticipates what later astronomers would reveal, that Earth is not the center, and the heavens are vast beyond reckoning. For Dante and his readers, the universe was not empty. It was structured, populated, and purposeful. A staircase, not only to understanding, but to salvation. In the medieval night, without electric light or modern noise, the sky was overwhelming. It stretched across the world as a vast ordered dome, a constant presence above kings and peasants alike. To live in that world was to live under something greater, something visible every evening but never fully explained. Without telescopes, without astrophysics, the stars became a canvas of speculation, and that speculation was rarely casual. For most people, the stars were not just objects, they were agents. To look up was not to encounter dead matter, but to face the unknown. The night sky was filled with meaning, whether divine or dangerous. A clear view of the constellations might bring a sense of order, but a new light, a moving shape, or a blood-red eclipse could trigger fear of war, death, or divine punishment. The stars served as both calendar and omen. Fear was not irrational. In an age of plagues, famines, and violent politics, uncertainty ruled everyday life. People wanted explanations, and they often found them above. The appearance of Halley's comet in 1066 was read as a harbinger of conquest. Less than a year later, England fell to the Normans. In 1345, a planetary alignment was blamed for the coming of the Black Death. When catastrophe struck, the heavens were part of the conversation. But the sky also stirred something else wonder. It suggested that there was more, that the world extended beyond the visible, beyond the known. Medieval scholars asked whether the stars had souls, whether the heavens contained beings we could not name. These weren't fringe ideas. They were debated in universities, recorded in manuscripts, and preached from pulpits. Religious frameworks tried to contain that wonder. Angels, demons, saints, all had their place in the vertical hierarchy. But even within doctrine, mystery remained. Augustine warned against excessive speculation, yet couldn't dismiss the stars entirely. Aquinas tried to rationalize celestial intelligences without drifting into fantasy. Theologians walked a narrow path between orthodoxy and imagination, attempting to explain a sky that refused to stay still. The hunger for answers didn't fade. It shaped how people viewed themselves. Were they alone in creation? Were they being watched? Was there meaning in the stars, or only signs? The lack of tools didn't stop the questions, it intensified them. Without telescopes, speculation expanded. Into theology, folklore, and art, the sky became a mirror. In it, people projected their fears, their hopes, their need for meaning. Whether seen as divine messengers, demonic omens, or distant watchers, the stars refused to be ignored. They filled the space above with possibilities, not always comforting, not always safe, but always present. For the medieval world, the edge of the known didn't end at the village boundary. It hung overhead every night, and in that vast darkness, lit by fire and silence, people searched not just for patterns, but for themselves.